Hi, I'm João Felipe, Moreira, Lopes, Ortega, Terra,
And I'm Antonio Amaral Villanova.
and we're both third-year undergraduate law students at UFRJ.
Today we're going to discuss a little bit about the article The Pacification of the Complexo do Alemão in Rio de Janeiro by Daniel Silva.
The text focuses on the pragmatics involved in creating a sanitized image of Rio and therefore of Brazil, especially in the international perspective, and the role it played in the pacification of the city in order to further the cause of promoting the mega events that were going to take place in the country in the past decade. In that light, it is vital to focus on how the operations were carried out and televised while carefully painting the picture of a war zone, as if depicting clear enemies and allies and embedding in the public eye how these policies could bring a distant but possible peaceful future. The very term pacification, semiotically speaking, goes a long way to build up expectations of long lasting paradigm shifts. However, the aftermath of these operations, as we now know, was far from it.
First of all, I think it is very important to deal with to explain what we're dealing with. The Complexo do Alemão is the neighborhood with the lowest human development index in all of the state of Rio de Janeiro, at only 0.711. That is a very, very, very low number. It is comparable to that of Libya, for example, that has suffered from many wars and internal conflicts in the last decade. The HDI, to better explain the situation of the neighborhood, the HDI is composed of three sub-indexes: the life expectancy index, the education index, and the income index. The fact that its results are so low attests only to how deeply engraved the problems of the region are. Uh, they cannot simply be dealt with by implanting a UPP, especially not in the molds that were used in Brazil. It requires changes in its deepest structures throughout a long time of governmental dedication, not through just an increase in the police activity in that region, especially in such an aggressive manner as was used in the region. This fact can be proven by the contrary example of Gávea, the neighborhood with the highest HDI in the city of Rio de Janeiro, at 0.97. Um, this number is even higher than that of Norway, for example, the highest HDI in the world. But it is right next to Rocinha, the biggest favela in South America. Yes, the biggest favela in the whole of South America is localized right here in the city of Rio de Janeiro. And for some reason, you simply do not see the same type of aggressiveness, of unpoliteness, the same treatment of the population inside in Gávea as compared to, for example, the Complexo do Alemão. Why is this so? Uh, there are many reasons that can be
Pointed out.
yeah, that can be pointed out. Some are social economical characteristics, and some of pure um, prejudices of the government and even of the local citizens.
It didn't have to be this way. The UPP is actually the result of two separate exchange programs that the city of Rio partook with other cities of the world, namely Medellin in Colombia and Boston in the United States. It's actually modeled after a program. It was preceded and modeled after a program called GPAI, which stands for Grupamento de Aplicação Prático Escolar. It's a proposition that was put forth in the police of Boston and was tried out in the communities of Cantagalo and Pavãozinho in the south side of Rio. While it was in place, The homicide rate of the region was reduced to an absolute zero for a period of 3 years, according to statistics from vivario.org. Uh, it prioritized a more community embezzled police model that that incentivizes actions of uh, avoiding violence, avoiding confrontation, and avoiding even gun use inside the community. It has a zero tolerance policy with corruption and police brutality, and has been shown to provide real long lasting effects. However, when even though it was successful and it eventually led to the creation of UPPs, UPPs were conducted and are still conducted to this day in a very different light. They have seemingly abandoned most of this uh,
Progressive.
non-ostentatious, progressive, and non-ostentatious, non-violent approach, and switch to a more um, being present, making yourself present by making yourself visible, making yourself aggressively visible with uh, lots of guns and lots of ostentatious police presence in these areas.
The story of Rio 2016 is actually very interesting, as Rio was actually competing with Chicago and Tokyo for to be the host of the 2016 Olympics. The Brazilian Olympic Committee brought the representatives from the International Olympic Committee to to all of the main tourist points of Rio de Janeiro in an absolutely fabricated experience. They made it so that almost no one was near the sites when they got there. They went to Copacabana, to the beaches of Copacabana, and they absolutely isolated the place. They went to Morro dos Irmãos, and last but not least, they took a very important detour to the top of Christ the Redemptor, and they ate there with the beautiful view of the city. Rio won the election to be the host of 2016 Olympic Games. However, the image that was sold was not that of the reality of the city. The reality of the city is an extremely unequal and, although beautiful, very corrupt and in many ways truly ugly, actually. You cannot separate the Rio de Janeiro that appears in films, that appears in postcards, and that was shown that day from the reality, the day to day of all the Carioca people that suffer from the mismanagement of a corrupt government that does not care uh, for its citizens. The politician that actually held this event and that prepared Rio for throughout throughout all of it was Eduardo Paes. Eduardo Paes many times spoke upon the importance of all of the city, and in one of in his biggest programs, to revitalize the Complexo do Alemão. But contradictorily speaking, even though Alemão was a poster for the security measures that would be put in place in order to not only prepare for the hosting, but to justify the spending on the events, since it would benefit from large-scale, long-lasting infrastructure investments. The northern region of the city, that was supposed to be one of the main regions to gain from this event, had actually very few benefits from it. Most of the work was actually done in the southern region and western zones of Rio de Janeiro. And some of these didn't even, and some of the works that should have been done weren't even completed. For example, the original idea was to connect the entire city with a very modern subway, keeping in track with the contemporary notions of a globalized city. What actually happened, however, was the precarious installation of BRT that was rushed in at the last moment as a provisional measure, as to not completely show the failure that was the preparation for the 2016 Olympics.
I see your points, Tom, and I would argue that the actions put in place at the time were directly responsible for the rise in the militias that we are experiencing in Rio now. You see, once the short-term effects of the operations were overblown, they became the standard for security policies all across the city. UPP started being present in almost every favela, and since they were not followed by those long-term investments in HDI developments we discussed earlier, they only created a vacuum of power where the militias can thrive. This is something Stuart Hall approaches a little bit in his writings. Today's globalized world demands a fast flow of information and people. It's impossible to stand still. But the state being absent in some of these areas meant that the militia started playing the role of the state and provided not only the basics such as water, gas, and light, but the globalized needs as well, like what we saw with vans for transportation or counterfeit television and internet packages, commonly known as gatunete, for entertainment and for exchange of information. The problem is, of course, that such parallel organizations often operate with violence, extortion, and fear mongering. There's a recent article on Estadão and Global that showed that around a fourth of Rio now has a militia in place. This is truly a chilling figure, and it goes to show how profitable the militias are.
Yes, exactly, Felipe. That study was conducted by Fluminense Federal University alongside the University of the State of São Paulo, and it mapped the presence of criminal groups in the city of Rio de Janeiro. It revealed that 57% of the city's territory has been occupied by militias, armed groups composed mainly of off-duty and former cops, who have access to weaponry and use their influence to induce fear in the population. Strangely enough, my friend, the area where there is police activity is 4 times more likely to have militias if compared to the regions where there is drug trafficking. On the other hand, it indicates that only 15% of Rio de Janeiro's territory has the presence of the above referred drug dealers, and 25% of the city is still being fought over by the militias and the drug dealers. And so, the study describes the city almost as a map of a war zone with different criminal groups dominating different specific areas and competing uh, between themselves to garner more power and influence. Another very alarming statistic is that only 1.9% of the city is free from any recurrent criminal activity. Amongst these neighborhoods that have no criminal activity whatsoever, most are from the southern region of the city, like Urca and Jardim Botânico, once more demonstrating the special treatment that the region receives. The study analyzed 37,883,000 reports regarding the criminal activities, be it by militias or by drug dealers, received from the Disque Denúncia service in 2019. The main source of these reports were the local citizens, who were extremely thorough with their descriptions. The militias work in the thin line between legality and illegality. Thus, investigations regarding them would have to be quite extensive.
One of the most complex and thorough investigations we've had on the subject is the work of CPI das Milícias, an investigation conducted by state representatives of UFRJ between 2007 and 2008. There was a very compelling article published by Agência Lupa, which is the fact-checking branch of Revista Piauí. It's basically following up on the 10-year anniversary of CPI das Milícias. Of course, The investigation was very important for shining a light on how articulate and organized Rio's militias were at that point, and it ends up with a list of suggestions that remain to this day amongst the most comprehensive and solid legislative efforts of the last decade in tackling the subject. This is actually a very bittersweet statement because while it was, of course, worthwhile, it is already 10 years old, and the militias, as you very much made clear earlier, show no sign of slowing down and are even being celebrated by some highly popular political figures of today. The article itself aims to look at the main points of the suggestion list, the people arrested, and the legislative advancements that have taken place since. It seemed that the most underrated consequence of CPI was its effect on the public perception, leading many to learn about the shortcomings and the negative effects of something so institutionalized that was happening for the very first time. As you said, it operates on the very fine line between legality and illegality, and sometimes the people that are being coerced don't even know how or even if it is possible to denunciate this sort of behavior. While in the first few years after the investigation was published, while the public eye was very much directed towards the subject, the number of milicianos arrested skyrocketed, even reaching up to 3 times what it was before the CPI. In the coming years, it gradually slowed down, eventually reaching a historic low in 2013, when there was only 55 arrests. So, with the number of arrests sinking, what we have to ask ourselves is the problem of militias gone for good? Well, of course not. They have only become more influential than ever. One reason for that, as the article proves, is that the main legislative points of the suggestion list were never approved by Alash, due to the vicious cycle of milicianos in politics. Out of the 5 politicians who were arrested as a result of CPI and lost their mandate, 3 were family members of Jerominho, whom was proven to be the head of Liga da Justiça, a militia in the west zone of Rio that has been active since the early 90s. Now, over 10 years later, most of them have recovered their political careers almost seamlessly. His daughter, Carminha, is now affiliated with the Partido da Mulher Brasileira party, and Jerominho himself was running for mayor up until very recently when he dropped out of the race. This goes to show how the long-term effects of the CPI were actually undermined by the very things that it was trying to tackle in the first place. Another point I'd like to make is regarding the concept of superdiversity, as mentioned by Virtuvek. Even though Virtuvek's point is made towards immigrant groups of the UK, I would argue it's possible to see the same points in the favelas. Once they are stigmatized as the other by the ruling class, they become a label in which wildly different groups are placed, with varying needs, realities, and dynamics, both introspectively and otherwise. Whether it is inside the same community, named, of course, introspectively, where you have varying degrees of inequality, hierarchies, job profiles, and even the whole struggle between working classes versus criminal factions versus militias now, has perhaps most exemplified by the giant casino with its very complex hierarchy and all of its different inequalities, or even between the favelas themselves. Like we discussed a little earlier, life is extremely different in communities of the South Zone, which wind up receiving much different treatment than the aforementioned Alemão in its rock bottom HDI. You have a super diverse group under the umbrella of the same terminology and under the umbrella of the same palliative measures, namely the UPP. This stigmatization by the ruling class is perhaps most flagrant in the research conducted by Dr. Teresa in her book The City of Walls regarding São Paulo, and especially when factoring in the immigration aspect of inequality in the city. In sum, it becomes clear that Complexo do Alemão is actually not being peaceful at all. The harsh measures put in place don't actually factor in the very diverse reality of Rio we discussed in our exposition, and don't do much to really tackle the basis of the problem, which is to have long-term effects to raise its human development index. We hope in the future we can have policies that more closely resemble that of the original plan, with better policing in mind that invest in intelligence and community efforts instead of aggressive, ostentatious, politically dressed up operations that only seek to raise death counts.
Thank you very much, and this is the end of our podcast.